A well-known socialite walked into a high-end restaurant, making an instant impression on everyone around. She was dressed in a stunning designer outfit, from head to toe, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor as she made her way to her table. The entire restaurant seemed to notice her arrival, and she knew it. With a flick of her hand, she dismissed the host, not even bothering to acknowledge him as he escorted her to her seat. The young waitress, who had only been working at the restaurant for a few months, felt a surge of nervous energy. She was still getting used to the upscale clientele, the pressure to maintain perfect service, and dealing with the occasional rude guest. But nothing had prepared her for someone like this socialite. As the waitress approached the table with a smile, she could already feel the judgment coming from the woman sitting in front of her. The socialite's eyes narrowed as she scanned the waitress from head to toe. "Well, isn't this a quaint place?" she said with a smirk, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The waitress smiled politely, though her nerves were beginning to show. She greeted the woman, asked about her drink preferences, and handed her the menu, hoping to move on from the awkward moment. But the socialite wasn't done. As the waitress turned to leave, she made a comment that cut through the air. "You look like you belong in the kitchen, not here," she sneered. The waitress froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. The comment was cruel, but she had been trained to remain professional. Instead of responding, she just nodded and walked away, trying to shake off the sting. The socialite continued to talk loudly, making sure her voice could be heard by others around the restaurant. She was clearly enjoying the attention. Every time the waitress returned to check on the table, the woman found something new to criticize. From the way she placed the silverware to the way she spoke, everything seemed to be an opportunity for the socialite to belittle her. The other diners started to take notice, their glances lingering on the scene unfolding in front of them. Some looked away, embarrassed to witness the treatment, while others seemed to watch with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. The waitress could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she did her best to keep a smile on her face. She had worked hard to get this job, and she wasn't going to let one rude customer ruin her day. But as the evening wore on, it became harder and harder to ignore the insults. It wasn't just the harsh words. It was the way the socialite acted, as if she were untouchable, as if everyone else around her was beneath her. Still, the waitress did her best to stay professional. She answered questions about the menu, refilled drinks, and delivered each course without a word of complaint. But inside, she felt a sense of humiliation building, one that she struggled to keep hidden behind a calm face. With each passing moment, the socialite's attitude grew worse. She barked orders, dismissed the waitress's attempts to explain anything, and made comments about how the restaurant wasn't up to her standards. The entire atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. The other patrons were starting to feel uncomfortable, sensing the tension between the waitress and the socialite. Some even looked at each other, exchanging glances as if they couldn't believe what they were witnessing. The whole situation was spiraling into something more than just bad service. It was becoming a spectacle, and no one seemed willing to step in to stop it. The waitress, feeling the pressure building, tried to focus on the task at hand. But deep inside, she couldn't help but feel a sense of injustice. She had never been treated like this before, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep her composure. The evening continued, and the socialite's behavior grew worse with each passing minute. She seemed to take pleasure in making the young waitress feel small, her words becoming sharper and more cutting. Every time the waitress came to the table, the socialite found something new to criticize. Her tone was always condescending, as if she were doing the waitress a favor just by allowing her to serve her. "Is this how you're trained to present food?" the socialite scoffed when the waitress placed the appetizer down with a slight shake of her hand. "I've seen better service at a fast food joint." The waitress's heart sank, but she smiled tightly, forcing herself to stay calm. She had learned the importance of maintaining composure, even in the face of disrespect. She turned and walked away, the harsh words echoing in her mind. As the meal progressed, the socialite's comments became even more personal. She made remarks about the waitress's accent, her appearance, and even the way she walked. "You should really do something about that posture," the socialite remarked loudly, clearly trying to get under the waitress's skin. "Don't you know how to stand up straight? You look like you've never had a day of proper training in your life." Each insult seemed to chip away at the waitress's patience, but she clung to her professionalism. She was used to rude customers. It came with the job. But this was different. This wasn't just a difficult customer. It was an ongoing attack on her character, her worth, and her dignity. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it together. Still, she reminded herself that she couldn't let the woman get to her. She had worked too hard for this job, and she couldn't afford to lose her cool. In between the socialite's insults, the other diners began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some tried to pretend they weren't paying attention, while others exchanged looks of disapproval. It was clear that they too found the socialite's behavior unacceptable. But no one spoke up. They all just watched in silence, unsure of what to do. The waitress took a deep breath as she approached the table once more, her mind racing with thoughts of what to say, how to handle the situation. But the socialite was already on her next rant. "You really think you can work in a place like this with that attitude?" she said dismissively. "If you ever want to get anywhere in life, you better learn some manners. This is not how people like me are treated." The words hit the waitress like a slap to the face. How could this woman be so cruel? And yet she couldn't show any weakness. The last thing she wanted was for the socialite to think she had gotten to her. She plastered on a fake smile, nodded, and walked away, doing her best to keep the tears from welling up in her eyes. With each encounter, the socialite's words became harder and harder to ignore. The waitress's heart was pounding in her chest. She had dealt with difficult people before, but nothing compared to this. There was something about the socialite's entitlement, the way she seemed to think that money gave her the right to belittle others, that made the situation unbearable. The socialite wasn't just rude. She was making the waitress feel as if she were invisible, unworthy of even basic respect. But no matter how hurt the waitress felt, she kept her composure. She had learned that her job required more than just serving food. It required patience, resilience, and the ability to rise above the insults. Yet, it was becoming more and more difficult to stay calm. The socialite's behavior had already gone too far, and with each passing minute, it was starting to feel like the waitress might not be able to keep it together for much longer. On Minnie, the waitress could feel her patience wearing thin as the night dragged on. With every step she took towards the table, she could almost sense the socialite's eyes on her, looking for the slightest mistake, the smallest flaw to attack. It was exhausting. Her smile, which had once come easily, was now forced, and her hands, which had once been steady, trembled slightly with each tray she carried. Each time she placed a dish in front of the socialite, the woman had something new to complain about. "This is cold," the socialite muttered, her tone dripping with disdain. "I specifically asked for it hot. How hard can it be to get something simple right?" The waitress's stomach tightened. She knew the dish had been freshly prepared, but there was no point in arguing. Instead, she nodded, apologized, and quickly moved on. As she walked away, the familiar sting of humiliation lingered in the back of her mind. She was used to customers being unhappy. Sometimes food didn't meet expectations. Sometimes there were delays. But this was different. The socialite wasn't just disappointed. She was enjoying the power she had over the waitress. With every complaint, the socialite seemed to grow bolder, more confident that she could push the waitress just a little bit further. The young woman could feel the eyes of the other diners on her as she passed their tables. Some gave her sympathetic looks, but none said anything. They were all just watching, as if waiting for something to happen. The room was filled with whispers, the murmurs of people who couldn't quite believe the way the socialite was treating the waitress. And the worst part was that no one seemed to be willing to do anything about it. The waitress had always believed that kindness and professionalism could break through even the toughest exterior. But tonight, she was starting to question that. Why was it always the customer's word that mattered? Why did people like the socialite get to have all the power? She had seen so many rude customers before, but there was something about the way this woman treated her that felt different, more personal, more cutting. When the socialite complained about the wine, saying it didn't have the right taste, the waitress almost snapped. She had been working here long enough to know that the wine was perfectly fine, but instead of defending herself, she forced a smile and apologized again, her voice barely above a whisper. She quickly brought a fresh bottle, hoping that would silence the complaints for a while. But deep down, she was growing tired. Tired of the constant insults. Tired of pretending everything was okay when it so clearly wasn't. She couldn't help but think about how different this woman's life must be. Everything seemed handed to her on a silver platter. Money, status, respect. While she, the waitress, had to work twice as hard to earn even a little bit of acknowledgement. The socialite lived a life where she could treat people however she wanted and get away with it, while the waitress had to take every insult quietly, never daring to challenge anyone, especially not a customer. By the time the main course was served, the waitress was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally as well. Her feet ached from running back and forth, her arms sore from carrying the heavy trays. But it was the weight of the socialites, words that had taken the most out of her. The constant barrage of insults had begun to wear her down, leaving her wondering if she was even cut out for this job. But no matter how badly she wanted to give in, she refused to let the socialite see her weakness. She couldn't let her win. As the evening stretched on, the waitress kept her composure, even though every step felt heavier than the last. She was determined to finish her shift, no matter how difficult it became. She knew that eventually the night would end, and she would be able to go home and leave the cruelty behind. But for now, she focused on doing her job, even as the insults kept coming. She was more than just a waitress. She was a person, and one who wouldn't let a rude customer define her. Au miniers, the evening continued. The atmosphere in the restaurant grew tense. The socialite's behavior had gone from rude to outright cruel. Every word she spoke was like a sharp jab, aiming to knock down the young waitress. The more the waitress tried to keep her composure, the more the socialite seemed to sense it, pushing harder, looking for any sign of weakness. It was during the third course, as the waitress placed the food on the table, that the socialite took things a step too far. She eyed the plate with a dismissive glance, and with a sneer she muttered, "This is what I get for paying for a fancy meal. Pathetic." The words stung. The waitress could feel her heart race in response, a mixture of frustration and disbelief flooding her thoughts. How could someone be so nasty? Was it really so hard to show even a bit of respect? As she stood there, trying to steady her breath and not let the emotions show, something inside the waitress snapped. The socialite, without noticing the shift in the waitress's eyes, continued to pick at her meal, her voice dripping with superiority as she made her next comment. "I bet your family doesn't even know what a real meal looks like. What do they call it? Cooked at home. How quaint." For a moment, everything else seemed to disappear. The noise of the restaurant, the clinking of silverware, even the murmurs of other diners, everything faded into the background. The only thing the waitress could hear was the insult, echoing in her mind. She had always prided herself on being patient, on taking the high road no matter how hard it was. But tonight, something about the socialite's words hit deeper than ever before. The waitress's hands clenched into fists at her sides, and she took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. She felt a fire growing inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was more a deep sense of injustice, a realization that she didn't have to just accept this treatment anymore. She was more than the role she played at the restaurant. She was more than the words this woman used to try to break her. She walked away from the table, her steps more purposeful than before. She felt her chest tighten, but this time it wasn't from fear or embarrassment. It was the beginning of something else, something that made her feel, for the first time in the night, like she had control over the situation. as she reached the kitchen. She took a moment to steady herself, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Her mind raced. She knew she couldn't let the socialite's words consume her, but part of her wanted to confront the woman, to tell her exactly how hurtful and unfair her behavior had been. But she stopped herself. She didn't want to stoop to the socialite's level. She was better than that. The power of silence could be just as effective, if not more so. When she returned to the table with the next course, she did so with a newfound strength. Her posture was straighter, her steps more confident. She placed the dish in front of the socialite, who, as usual, had something to say. "Finally, some decent service," the woman remarked with a smirk. But this time, the waitress didn't react. She simply nodded and turned away, not giving the socialite the satisfaction of seeing her affected. The power had shifted. The socialite might have had her words, but the waitress had her dignity, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that away. The rest of the meal passed in relative silence. The socialite continued to grumble and complain, but the waitress didn't engage. She did her job, and she did it well, despite the woman's attempts to undermine her. With every step, the socialite's voice seemed to fade into the background, as if the waitress was learning to block it out. It was a small victory, but it was enough. By the time the socialite had finished her meal, the waitress had already decided that no matter how rude or cruel the woman had been, she wouldn't let it define her. She had endured, and in that quiet moment of strength, she knew she had won. As the evening progressed, the tension in the restaurant began to build. The socialite, still oblivious to the shift in the waitress's demeanor, continued to criticize everything from the temperature of her food to the music playing in the background. But as the waitress walked towards the table once again, something felt different. Something had changed within her. She no longer felt like a passive observer of the insults. Instead, she had an overwhelming sense of quiet power that she wasn't sure she had ever felt before. As she placed the next dish on the table, the socialite once again made a snide comment. "Is this supposed to impress me?" she sneered. "I've seen better at roadside stalls." But this time, the words didn't sting the way they once did. The waitress didn't let them pierce her heart. Instead, she simply looked at the socialite and, without a word, stepped back. For the first time in the evening, the socialite paused. She was used to people reacting to her words, whether with apology, fear, or even laughter. But there was something about the way the waitress held her ground, silent and unwavering, that made her falter. The socialite looked at the young woman for a moment longer than she usually would, and for the first time there was uncertainty in her eyes. The silence between them grew, stretching out for what felt like forever. It wasn't the kind of silence that was uncomfortable. It was a calm, steady silence, one that spoke volumes. The other diners, who had been watching the scene unfold from their tables, noticed the change. A few exchanged glances, perhaps recognizing the subtle shift in the air. The waitress had stopped responding to the insults. She wasn't angry or upset. She was simply unaffected. The socialite's words had no power anymore, and the realization seemed to slowly dawn on her. The waitress continued with her duties, moving around the restaurant, taking orders and serving food, but with an almost peaceful grace. She was no longer frazzled by the socialite's constant negativity. She had learned to detach herself from the situation, recognizing that no matter how loud or rude the woman was, she could not take away her sense of self-worth. As she moved past the table, again, the socialite finally spoke, but her tone was less mocking now. "Well, I guess that's the best I can expect here," she muttered, still not completely free of her arrogance, but the sharp edge in her voice had softened. The waitress merely nodded, offering a quiet smile before walking away, leaving the woman to her meal. It wasn't a victory that could be easily seen, but the feeling of quiet triumph was unmistakable. In the kitchen, the waitress took a moment to breathe. She wasn't sure what had happened in those last few minutes, but she felt lighter, freer somehow. It was as if the weight of the socialite's words had finally lifted off her shoulders. She realized that, despite everything, the socialite had failed to break her. And in doing so, she had found a kind of inner strength she didn't know she had. The rest of the meal passed without incident. The socialite, though still a little disgruntled, didn't make any more cruel comments. The waitress continued to serve with the same professionalism she had always shown, but now there was an ease in her steps, a quiet confidence that had not been there before. She wasn't looking for approval from anyone. She wasn't waiting for anyone's validation. She was simply doing her job and doing it well. As the socialite finished her meal and prepared to leave, she quickly signaled for the check. The waitress approached, still composed, her expression calm and professional. She handed over the check, and as the socialite reached for her wallet, there was a brief moment of silence between them. The woman didn't offer any apology or acknowledgement of her earlier behavior, but the waitress wasn't waiting for one. She had already let go of the need for it. The socialite left the restaurant without another word, and as the door closed behind her, the tension that had filled the room slowly dissipated. The other diners, who had witnessed the entire encounter, returned to their conversations, though there was a new sense of respect for the waitress in the air. She had stood tall, had endured, and had kept her dignity intact. The waitress took a deep breath as she wiped down the counter, her heart still, beating a little faster than usual. But this time, it wasn't out of anxiety. It was the feeling of quiet victory, the knowledge that she had faced something difficult and come out the other side stronger. She didn't need anyone else's approval. She knew her worth, and no one could take that away from her. As the night went on, the atmosphere in the restaurant slowly returned to normal. The socialite had left, and the hum of quiet conversations filled the room again. But for the waitress, things felt different. There was a sense of calm that had settled over her, something she hadn't expected after the intense moments with the customer. She couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed, but she knew one thing for sure. She had made it through without losing herself. The silence between her and the socialite had spoken louder than anything the woman had said. The harsh words that had once stung so deeply seemed like nothing now, fading into the background. In that brief moment, the waitress had realized that she didn't need to engage with negativity to maintain her dignity. The socialite had tried everything: mockery, insults, even a sense of superiority that could knock anyone down. But it hadn't worked on her. She walked to the back of the restaurant and leaned against the kitchen counter for a moment, allowing herself a deep breath. The adrenaline from the encounter was still there, but it had shifted from frustration and embarrassment to something else: pride. She was proud of herself. Proud that she hadn't let the woman's words tear her down. Proud that she had stayed true to who she was. Most importantly, she was proud that she hadn't allowed someone else's anger or bitterness to control her. The other staff members, who had seen the tension between the two women, came over to check on her. They knew it had been a tough night for the waitress, and they offered their support. Some even gave her a quick hug or a pat on the back, showing their solidarity. It felt nice to know that others had noticed the way she had held herself under pressure. It was easy to get lost in the rush of work, in the tasks that had to be done. But in that moment, she realized that people were paying attention to the way she handled herself, not just to the way she served the food, but to the way she handled difficult situations with grace. The rest of the evening felt lighter despite the earlier tension. She moved around the restaurant with confidence, her steps more sure than they had been before. She had faced one of the worst customers she could imagine and had kept her composure, something she hadn't been sure she could do. And that realization gave her a new sense of strength. As the night came to an end and the restaurant slowly began to empty, the waitress took a moment to reflect. She had learned something valuable about herself, something she hadn't expected to discover when she first started working here. She had always thought that keeping calm in the face of adversity meant suppressing her emotions, never letting anyone see her hurt. But tonight had taught her that strength didn't always mean keeping quiet. Sometimes, Strength was in knowing when to hold your ground and when to let go. The manager, who had been watching her all evening, came over to offer a few words of praise. He thanked her for handling the situation with such professionalism, noting that she had maintained the integrity of the restaurant even in the face of a difficult customer. She smiled and nodded, grateful for the acknowledgement. It wasn't just about the praise. It was about knowing she had done her job well, despite the challenges. As she cleaned up her station and prepared to leave for the night, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The socialite's cruel words had lost their power over her. She had faced them head-on, and they no longer had any hold on her. The waitress had proven something important to herself that night. She didn't need anyone else's approval or validation to know her worth. She was enough, just as she was. Walking out of the restaurant and into the cool night air, she felt a sense of freedom that she hadn't felt in a long time. The world around her seemed a little lighter. She didn't need to carry the weight of others' judgments with her. And as she made her way home, she realized that no matter what happened tomorrow or the day after, she would always have the strength to handle whatever came her way. The night had been tough, but it had also been a turning point, one that would stay with her long after the socialite's insults faded from her memory. The following days at the restaurant felt different for the waitress. It was as if something inside her had changed. The socialite's harsh words no longer lingered in her mind, and the memories of the cruel encounter didn't weigh on her the way they once would have. She walked into work with her head held higher, her steps more confident, as though a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The confidence she had gained after standing her ground in the face of such disrespect had transformed the way she saw herself and the world around her. On the first day back after the incident, she noticed a shift in the way the other staff members interacted with her. They had all witnessed how the socialite had treated her, and they had all seen how gracefully she had handled the situation. There were smiles, pats on the back, and even a few quiet words of respect. They all seemed to admire the way she had kept her composure. It was an unspoken bond that formed among the team that day, as if they had all shared in her quiet victory. The customers too seemed to notice something different about her. She still greeted them with the same politeness and professionalism, but there was a new warmth in her interactions, a calm confidence that made people feel comfortable in her presence. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough to be noticed by the regulars. Some even mentioned it to the manager, commenting on how they'd noticed the difference in her attitude. The waitress wasn't sure what had shifted, but she knew it had to do with the way she had handled the situation with the socialite. It wasn't about the words spoken or the insults hurled at her. It was about how she responded to them, how she chose to rise above them instead of letting them define her. A few days later, one of the regular customers came up to her as she was clearing a table. "You know," the customer said with a smile, "I watched how you handled that woman the other night. You're a lot stronger than most people realize." The waitress smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. It was a simple comment, but it meant a lot to her. It was the kind of recognition she hadn't expected, but now appreciated more than anything. She had always prided herself on her work ethic and dedication, but now she understood that strength wasn't just about hard work. It was also about maintaining her dignity in the face of adversity. With time, the waitress found herself becoming more patient and understanding, not just with customers, but with herself. She had always been hard on herself, especially when it came to her job. She would replay every mistake in her mind, focusing on how she could have done things differently. But now, after everything that had happened, she realized that mistakes were part of life, part of learning and growing. What mattered was how she moved forward, how she used those experiences to become better, not just at her job, but at life. The socialite's insults had been harsh, but in the end, they had helped her realize something important. She didn't need anyone's approval to feel valuable. She didn't need to seek validation from people who didn't see her worth. The only person who needed to believe in her was herself. That was a lesson she had learned the hard way, but it was one that would stay with her for the rest of her life. As she left work that night, The waitress took a moment to look around. The restaurant was quieter now, with the last few diners finishing their meals. She could feel a sense of peace within her, a quiet strength that she had never known before. The socialite's words no longer mattered. What mattered was how she saw herself, how she had handled the situation with grace, and how she had learned to stand tall even when others tried to bring her down. Walking out into the night, she felt like a different person, stronger, more confident, and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She had learned that, in the end, the only thing that could truly define her was how she responded to the world, not how the world treated her. And with that realization, she knew she could face anything, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it might seem. The journey to self-empowerment had only just begun, but she was ready for it. To many,